I have been spending a lot of time with the Find X9 lately, and honestly, this has been one of the most conflicting review processes I have ever had. I've been shooting this side by side with many modern flagships like the iPhone 17, OnePlus 15, as well as the Xiaomi 15, and I can confirm the results are no less than fascinating. The X9 has some massive strengths that make the iPhone look boring, but it also has some flaws that frankly shouldn't be on a phone this expensive. Let's start with the biggest differentiator, the processing. Hasselblad has tuned this phone to handle light in a very specific way, and you see it immediately in high contrast scenes. Check out this shot with the sun rays coming through the trees. If you look at the iPhone 17 shot next to it, it has got way more contrast. Much of the shadows are crushed on the iPhone, and it is not fake shadow boost in post-processing. There are actually more details on the X9, but more on the dynamic range later, because notice the edges of the leaves. I think that bloom looks very cinematic. It is not present everywhere. It is not one of those soft light effects. Seems like some type of internal processing, which is also very hard to recreate naturally in other scenes. I think it is very clever handling of highlights, because if you compare such scenes with the OnePlus, the over-sharpened, more defined edges actually look far worse and cheap. But I also have another question. Why the artificial saturation boost? It sure is way less than OnePlus 15, but if you compare such a scene with the Leica processing on Xiaomi phones or even the iPhone 17, they just look more natural. This saturation boost brings a perceived difference in white balance. The term perceived is important here, because this phone has got a really good white balance, especially in a scene with a lot of foliage, which definitely influences the ambient lighting. The white building looks more natural. Even under harsher conditions, it can maintain colors properly. This becomes even more noticeable when you bring a human subject into the scene. The skin tone is quite accurate. If imported into Resolve, notice how the color of my skin lands squarely on the skin tone line inside the vector scope. It slightly does tend to the right, which means my face looks a bit redder than usual, but the iPhone 17 here is a little bit more yellow. It is less noticeable because of no saturation boost, which also gives a wrong feeling that it has more accurate colors. But what about a harsher backlit scene where dynamic range becomes more important? This is where things get a little bit more complicated. My skin tone here looks way off on X9. But again, that is because of the saturation boost. The iPhone looks better primarily for that reason. Now, going back to more nature architectural scenes under harsh lighting, I noticed that X9 is aggressively denoising images. If you zoom in on the walls or maybe the window frames, the texture looks almost like a smooth slab of chocolate. It is too clean. There is not a speck of noise visible. Despite that smoothing, the shadow detail is fantastic. Even though the texture is soft, I can clearly see the veins and midribs of the leaves in the dark corners, whereas iPhone just crushes those areas into black. Now, while I love dynamic range, I have to talk about the optics. This is where the Oppo could not keep up with their promise, and that is chromatic aberration. If you look at the corners of the ultra-wide shots, especially leaves against bright sky, it is a mess. You can see distinct purple and cyan fringing. It is not just in the extreme corners either, it starts creeping towards the center frame. Ultra-wide lenses have this issue, yes, and you might also argue that it is a part of the natural imperfections of a vintage lens that Hasselblad might be trying to chase, but Oppo has particularly talked about better aberration control with the new proprietary Lumo engine. So it is directly, visibly the opposite of what you would expect after reading their marketing terms. When I switch over to the iPhone 17, the fringing is just not there. I can't really say the iPhone's optics are just clinically superior here, because aberrations are pretty easy to fix with software processing. They're also not present in the main cameras of the X9, only in the ultrawide and slightly in tele. But there is another reason why I can't say the optics are bad, because of the brilliant flare control. If you compare this to other 2025 flagships like the OnePlus 15 at around the same price, it looks bad. But again, the OnePlus thing is actually more complex than what it seems from the outside, so more on that in a separate video. Overall, I have seen Oppo has by far the best flare control. It is consistently lesser than the iPhone as well as the OnePlus. But keeping all of that aside, the important question remains how clear the final output is. In normal shots, the iPhone is just not as clear as the Oppo. But does it give the full picture? No. The pictures taken on Oppo are way larger in size than those taken by the iPhone, which means they also carry more information by default. Switching to max res on both the phones reveal the full story. Oppo has by far the clearest ultra-wide lens I have used on a phone so far. Impressive clarity. The main camera is also great, but the iPhone gives you slightly better clarity here. And finally, the telephoto lens, which is also pretty good in terms of clarity. Now let's talk about portrait mode, and this is where the X9 absolutely destroys the base iPhone 17. Because the iPhone 17 lacks a telecamera, it has to crop in on the main sensor. The result lacks the optical crispness of the X9. And looking at the edge detection in portrait mode, it's genuinely surprising how much the iPhone struggles here. Look at my shoulder. The iPhone 17 is blurring the edges of my jacket into the background. It looks like a bad Photoshop job. The Oppo isn't perfect, but it is significantly more confident than the iPhone. But wait until you see the OnePlus 15 here. I don't know what they fed their cameras, but this looks incredible. The edge detection is so good on OnePlus 15, it literally separates out individual strands of hair. In harsher scenes, I'll still say it is more on the levels of the X9. One small detail, the bokeh on the Oppo tends to be more octagonal, not circular, especially at higher f-stops. I don't know about you, but I do like it. Oppo does a better job with the bokeh than most of the phones I own. The iPhone has that Gaussian look in the harsher scenes, which I'm not a fan of. Oh, and this is how ultra-zoomed images look on Oppo X9. It definitely does the job, but yes, optical zoom can only go so far. So even with all of those AI upscaling and all, it does not look completely natural. Finally, I took these out for a night spin. In the ultra-wide, the X9 performs excellently. It is brighter and also has way more details than the iPhone, especially in the darker areas. Like, look at these leaves. They have almost vanished on the iPhone. Bringing in the OnePlus here, it also cannot outperform the X9. Again, notice the shadows. Same goes for the main cameras, and this is also primarily because X9 has got a larger main sensor, along with a lower f-stop, which gives the hardware level advantage for cleaner night shots. But again, if I bring in the year-old Xiaomi here, it still holds up very well. Holds up well would be wrong, it performs better. Like in this image, notice how the shadows have more details on the Xiaomi. I would say the name of Xiaomi sensor Light Fusion is pretty apt. iPhone does a very weird processing in night shots. The images look more faded than what you would actually want them to be. It tries so hard to find texture that the wall starts to look more ugly than it actually is. The X9 carries much of the cinematic vibe into the video. I particularly loved using the telephoto camera because of the more natural focal length and the shallower depth of field. The iPhone falls short in both the areas here. The quality difference becomes more noticeable if I compare it to the OnePlus, which has got a tad bit more optical zoom. The X9 still has got more clarity. Notice the dry leaf. OnePlus, however, maintains more details in the background. The X9 is blown out in comparison. I also noticed the autofocus performance is great across all the cameras. It is not like the OnePlus, which is really frustrating and inefficient. There is still one thing where the other two phones surprisingly perform better, which is also weird since on hardware level the X9 is better. Notice how the clarity on the X9 is lesser in these scenes, both when the light is favorable as well as unfavorable. When I switched to a more harsh scene with HDR, it made more sense. The X9 cameras can be pushed a little bit more in post while you are editing. I still do not like the fact that there is so much of chromatic aberration. It is significantly lesser than the OnePlus, but the iPhone 17 looks way better in this scene. I also could do crazy stuff while editing to boost the dynamic range of the footage further, which although can be done on the X9, but you need to stop early, else the purple edges will become more noticeable. In the ultra-wide lens, the iPhone has got the widest FOV, so it wouldn't be fair to compare the clarity. If you keep the OnePlus and the Oppo side by side, they look the same. I can't say there is much of a difference here. But here is another HDR comparison in a particularly harsh scene. Notice how the dark areas on the X9 are far more visible than the OnePlus, but the iPhone still certainly does outperform the other two phones. And if you're wondering how the X9 will handle exposure when you move from dark to very bright scenes, here is a footage for that. It is shot in Dolby Vision. I'm also going to show the same footage for iPhone so you can compare. During the nighttime, Oppo performs much better than the iPhone, primarily again because of the hardware advantage Oppo has got. The X9 also seems to maintain colors more accurately in the night. In the ultra-wide video, again, iPhone is much wider, but overall during the night I found the Oppo to be clearer. In more dynamic scenes, you will notice that even though the main camera has got OIS, the footage on X9 starts to look more messy than what you would expect. The ultra-wide camera in comparison still looks worse. Also, did you notice how smooth the lens change was? Pretty impressive. Now let's talk about some of the other cool stuff that the cameras can do. That is the 4K 120fps Dolby Vision. Now it is present on both the phones, Oppo as well as OnePlus. I tried my level best to capture a butterfly. Now the best part of having such a high-res slow motion video support is that you can shoot first and frame later. But I will be honest here, I still found myself using the telephoto lens with slow motion at FHD way more than this. The optical advantage beats the resolution boost, especially for subjects that are far away. But yes, in more dynamic scenes where you need a 4K slow motion wide angle shot, the X9 has got way more leverage. And the best thing is you can shoot up to 4K 120fps in O-log, and getting the LUT was also very easy. The link is in the description. I don't know why it looked a bit too contrasty and dark for me, but it was a pretty easy fix anyway. One thing I loved is how easy it is to get all the files. They are very neatly presented. Next is the cinematic video. The iPhone can also shoot this in Dolby Vision, which is impressive. None of the other phones can do that. And the edge detection is also good, provided the fact that it has got no telephoto lens and the footage is zoomed in. Oppo and OnePlus both have cinematic video up to 4K in the telephoto lens. Okay, time to take a few selfies. First, when I was in my chauffeur-driven limousine, I noticed the X9 consistently maintained better dynamic range than OnePlus. It also could take shots faster. There were slightly lesser instances of shaky, blurry pictures. But there's another thing. I don't know if you can see it or not, but Oppo has got a slight natural background blur, which is neither present on the OnePlus nor the iPhone. I also took front camera portraits and all of the phones performed very well in terms of edge detection. I also noticed the octagonal bokeh of the X9 is absent here for some reason. It is circular. I love the bokeh on my Xiaomi more here. In videos, I found Oppo to be quite a bit sharper under very harsh lighting. It is also sharper than the iPhone 17. It captures all the imperfections. I also noticed the very slight background bokeh present in the videos too, which confirms that it is an optical characteristic of the lens, absent on both OnePlus and the iPhone. And that brings us to the end of this video. Do like, share and subscribe. Ask me if you have any doubts in the comments and I'll definitely clarify. That's all again, and I'll catch you in the next one.